you very much, and good morning, everybody. It's very exciting for me to be part of this and to help kick off today's session. I like wandering around, so it did occur to me that I'm South African, so it may take a while in terms of diversity to get used to my accent. But I did enjoy Justin's sort of self-effacing start, and just wondering if I could make it sound authentic being South African and being self-effacing. It wouldn't really work. So I'm going to kind of kick off and turning into the real sort of the business part of the day. And I think this is a terribly exciting initiative, and I would love to see initiatives like this in other industries. Just to give you an idea of my background, because I'll try and refer to that in this, I started life as a musician, and I think the picture in the bottom left, which hopefully immersively you can't see, that's me meditating on the boot of the car. And when you go into talent strategy, you can see what happens to you. It goes there. I've worked as a consultant in the States, which was really exciting coming out of South Africa, to give me my first taste of diversity, also echoing some of Justin's sentiments about the ideas of adjusting and working in different cultures. I then did a technology startup, which taught me something very interesting. It taught me about the value of working with people, because in effect we were selling commodities. We were the largest computer parts, memory drives distributor in the Southern Hemisphere. And because what we were selling was effectively a commodity, the only difference that we could make to our competitors in those markets were the people that we employed. Now, I think advertising, in a sense, should be the opposite of a commodity, and I would hate to hear if people were saying, yes, but we compete strongly on price, because I think it was very much the point that was made a few seconds ago, is that you should be selling on value, and that's the total value added by what you do in advertising, rather than by the space that you're selling and the creativity that you're doing. And yet, value is added by people. It's only added by talent. Machinery and the internet has got limited value. Once it's there, it has a ceiling set on it before you start. And I'm a great believer in that people have got absolutely no ceiling. And I certainly discovered that in my own operation when we kicked off, which led me, in a sense, to selling that. The company IPO'd. And I was fortunate enough to come to the UK to do a PhD in psychology. Again, the interest in people. And today, that's really what my life is all about. I do a lot of consultancy, sharing experiences, doing a lot of research into what makes great teams. What makes organizations differentiate each other and add value through their people. So that's really a bit of a context. I've worked with some good companies. So the first point as we kick this off is to look at this idea of the changing value of organizations. I'm just going to sort of keep an eye on time because we've got about half an hour. But the first point that I want to make is that if you looked at what the stock market, how it evaluated organizations in 1978, you'll see that 95% of a company's value, as valued on, say, the stock market, was what you would get for the organization if you sold it in a fire sale. So if you burnt all the buildings and you replaced all of the hard stuff, that is called the book value of the organization, and it represented 95% of the stock market value. Something amazing happened over that period from 1978 to 2002. And that is that suddenly you're finding that only 72% of an organization is represented by its hard assets, its buildings, and its machinery and its technology. And people were paying 28% more than the fire sale value of the organization. What is it that they were paying for now that suddenly people felt this organization is worth more than its hard assets? And clearly the answer wraps down to what I call the enterprise capital framework, which is how I look at organizations and think about organizations. If you consider a company, you can say that it consists of three key components. You've got the tangible assets, which are roughly the things that you can kick. You've got, on the right-hand side, you've got the probably too true, isn't it? You've got the financial capital, which is the moolah, the money, the cash. And then there's this interesting block, which I think represents that part of the organization that is adding value which is the intellectual capital. We're going to be focusing on the middle component, which is the human capital, but customer capital clearly represents a lot of value in organizations, as does the structural capital, which is the capability of the organization. Now, if our focus today is on this part, which is generating so much value for the organization, and increasingly, by the way, so I fully expect, if we just go back, there to that slide, this thing goes at its own pace. If we just look at this here, I fully expect that 72% to start decreasing. So you're going to start seeing more and more value is going to start coming out of the intellectual property, the human capital, the customer capital, and the structural capital, where people represent just about everything. And I think this was really brought home to me. And when you start seeing companies like Facebook starting to IPO into the billions, and you look at the actual assets of the organization, how many hard assets are there? There are virtually none. It's the desks that people are sitting at, and a couple of servers, which are, you know, a couple of million quid at the most. So billions are the value of the people, and I think that's only going to get more as we move into an era where the hard assets start becoming less important. So just looking at each of those, how competitively differentiating are they? Because we're here to talk about talent and human capital. If you look at each of the resources, how well do each of those differentiate one advertising agency from another agency? Well, in terms of tangible assets, it's absolutely clear that you can't differentiate yourself from competitors on tangible assets, because everybody can virtually have the same assets. If you have a look at financial capital, if you've got a good business plan, private equity or a bank is probably going to provide the money to you. In terms of the intellectual capital, customer capital, everybody is working with the same markets and the same customers, so they're not differentiating. Likewise, structural, it's absolutely clear that the one resource, the one asset that is most difficult to copy, to imitate, is human capital. If you were to say, I'm going to replicate agency A because they are the market leader, you could probably replicate every aspect of them, including their client market. The one part that you would have to work in the medium term, 3 to 5 years to replicate or longer, is going to be their human capital. And that's really what today is all about, is how do we focus on this idea of human capital? I'm not going to go into a whole financial thing today, although I know there are a number of financial people in the room. The real point of the slide is that it moves from right to left. And all it's saying is that the ultimate left-hand box is that most commercial organizations, for-profit organizations, like my own, that I IPO'd, everything is about returning value to shareholders. Of course, you need a wider brief than that. You need to be looking at corporate social responsibility. You need to be looking at society. You need to be looking at the employee's well-being. But in terms of the very existence of the company, there's no question that in capitalism, investors are going to withdraw their capital from the organization if they aren't getting the return that they want. And this diagram is an interesting example taken from an accounting firm of how moving from right to left, how that is driven. And if you skip through some of the middle parts, which are slightly technical about return on capital, is how you grow the company. The second last slide on the right-hand side is that ultimately all organizations, including your own, grow through the quality of what you produce. In other words, how well does it meet your clients' needs? Innovation, how well can you innovate compared to your competitors? How productive are you? And I think you've covered a lot of that on previous Adaptathons. And how well do you grow your customer base? Now, looking at each of those for a second, there is no way that each of those are not driven by your talent, by your human capital, by your people. The most crucial factors, not only for thriving, but just for surviving even in the advertising industry, all boil down to the quality of the people. And what we're going to be talking about today is the critical role that diversity will play in attracting, retaining, and developing the right types of people that represent not only those people that you're going to be using and selling your services to, but those people that are going to be delivering. Without that kind of human capital, without that talent, without that innovation, I have no doubt in my mind that your agency is not going to be around to tell the tale. So I would say that today is a really crucial stepping stone in in the industry moving forward. And as I said earlier, I would love to see this repeated in other industries. So, kudos to you for lifting this off. So just as an indication, I thought this was great. How much do organizations invest in human capital? These figures are probably a year or two or a year or three old. But in terms of percentage of revenues invested, it's enormous. In TMT, in media now, in technology, 37% and more. Industry, even manufacturing, which is traditionally hardware, is 25%. In pure knowledge industries, well more than 50% of spend now goes into talent management and into people. If you add up salaries, all of the development programs, all of the recruitment, all of the retention issues that Ian was talking about earlier, these are enormous sums. For me, the HRD, HR directors in organizations, are the heroes. They might be unsung heroes, but we're going to be hearing a lot more about them for these reasons, I think, in the future. So, here's a typical question that people say is, should we be investing in people? And I don't know if you can see this cartoon clearly from where you're sitting. But to me, this kind of sums it up. It's the CFO and the CEO. And the CFO is saying, what happens if we spend money on training these people and they leave us with our 30% churn in the industry? And the CEO asks a great question. He says, what happens if we don't spend the money and they stay? And I think that's the dilemma that organizations talk about, is that are employees an asset or are they an expense? Sometimes employees are characterized as being the only asset that has leather on its feet, that allows it to walk. And so why would we want to spend money? And we see this in call centers all the time, adopting what's known as a sacrificial HR strategy, where you spend absolutely as little as you can and you cope with the churn and you have great systems for recruiting and bringing new people in with spending as little of them as possible. It's not going to work in most knowledge-based industries, because it's the developing knowledge of your people that ultimately reflects the quality and the value that is delivered to agencies today. So in terms of the drivers that I'd like to look at briefly, that was kind of the technical part of what I'm going to do. I think this is a slightly more fun part of the session. I'm going to focus a lot on Gen Y and Gen X and the baby boomers, having a look at diversity through age, but the principles that we'll talk about are going to apply through all of the diversities that Ian spoke about earlier. So for example, I tend to use the acronym GRACES with 2 R's and 2 A's, I think. Gender, race, religion, ability, disability, age, culture, ethnicity, sexuality. So GRACES is the acronym. So anytime I'm recruiting, anytime I'm developing, I look to see, are we ticking all the boxes in the GRACES on those? So I'm going to be focusing a little bit on age, but we'll try and generate those. Because I'm getting old, I think that age starts becoming more meaningful to me. So as a brief reminder, if anybody needs to know, I think the ad industry is probably more aware of these demographics than most. Silent generation, baby boomers, Gen X, and Gen Y. Those are the rough ages that go with each of those. So if you characterize each of those, Skipper, that's what we're going to be looking at here. Go through. I'm going to come back to the valuing your talent, because I'm just conscious that we need to get through some time on this. The silent and traditional generation, typically characterized, and this is now looking at them in terms of the workplace today, are typically characterized as people who delay gratification, very loyal to the organization that they would have worked for, and discipline is probably is something that they would have understood very well as managers, as leaders, as bosses of organizations. Hierarchy is very big. Moving into the baby boomer generation. Baby boomers are the first generation of people who were evaluated on their interpersonal skills. Prior to the war years, you would never have thought of evaluating somebody in terms of how they work together in a team. So you've got baby boomers, work ethic being lived to work, very into hierarchies post-war, as they structured everything to get the organizations moving. And for example, in the workplace, they would be used to a regular annual feedback session to tell them how they're working and how they're moving on. That generation tended to work so hard, as many of you will know, that their kids ended up not seeing them a hell of a lot. So you had children who would be coming home from school, otherwise known as the latchkey kids, to a list of tasks which they would do on their own, at home, unsupervised, and they would be Generation X. Generation X are a fascinating generation. I mean, that's where your Steve Jobses, that's where a lot of your innovators came from. They were people who busted hierarchies. They were the rebels. They would have gone against their parents. They had very little care from home, and they achieved a lot by working on their own and not by having to follow hierarchies and follow other people. They gave birth to Gen Y, which I can see strongly in the room today. And Gen Y had a very interesting time because I am a psychologist by background, and so before I got into this work, when I worked as a therapist, it was always interesting working with Gen X parents because the amount of guilt that was passed on to them by their baby boomer parents who they never saw, they said, my kids are never going to be a latchkey kid. I'm going to nurture my kids. I'm going to give my kids the kind of attention that I never got while my folks were busy earning a fortune to try and bring me up and give me the education that I've got. The result of that is we've got a great difference between Gen Y and Gen X, whereas Gen X are used to operating completely alone with very little nurturing and esteem feedback. Gen Y have grown up with tons of nurturing and require a lot more feedback in order to continue performing effectively relative to Gen X, who prefer not to get much feedback. Now, neither one of those models is right or wrong. It's really what you grew up with, I suppose. I grew up in a family where I had my dad worked, so I hardly ever saw my dad. My mum was around a heck of a lot, so I was allowed to get on with my stuff. So I've got quite a few Gen Y characteristics is that I was nurtured, but learned to get on with things like management and guy stuff without a heck of a lot of support. So no rights or wrongs in these models per se. It's just the conflict arises pretty much in the next slide, where you're starting to see in organizations, the interesting point I thought that Ian made earlier, is this business that baby boomers are simply not retiring, number one. So whereas the oldies were supposed to get out of the organization, retirement age, I think, wasn't it 60 not too long ago? It was. I mean, we're now getting to the point, and from a recent Gallup poll, where the average age is 62 and rising rapidly. So you're seeing these baby boomers staying on in the organization. But is that a problem? So what? We've got a number of old people around. Yes, it's a huge problem. When you've got a generation of people who are used to strict hierarchies and running talent and running human capital in a particular way, and a new generation of Gen Ys who are very used to operating collaboratively, because that's a big trademark of Gen Y, you start getting a lot of clash and a lot of intercultural clashes in the workplace, which is a major issue. So, in general, the clashes are born of Gen Y don't really operate with the concept of loyalty so much as Gen X would have. Gen Y would generally say, I would rather be where the action is rather than being in the same agency because my parents stayed in the same place of work all of their lives and therefore it's expected of me to stay in the same place of work. Gen Y simply don't think that way. They would be saying, where is the most value that I can add to my life and to society? So that's another interesting facet that we're going to be getting used to now with recruitment in terms of diversity, is that most of the generations that we're recruiting are interested in what is the meaning, not only of my work, but the meaning of society and what is going on in the world around me. So this idea of injecting meaning into work is becoming critically important. What all of these differences mean, in effect, is that leaders, which includes you in the room and which includes HR, have got to start looking at how to manage 3 or possibly 4 generations, if you say that there's still a lot of the silent or traditional generation. How do you manage an organization with 4 different sets of values at the same time and get high performance out of them? It's an awesome challenge, and one which I personally love challenges. So for me, finding structures and ways to do that would be absolutely fascinating. So that's something which I think would be an interesting conversation this afternoon. I enjoyed this cartoon when I saw that, if you can see it. I guess it's utterly true. Yeah. So, the potential for generational conflict is enormous, and time not really being on our side to go through, so I hope that there's an opportunity. I have said that this presentation can be sent out if anybody wants copies of it to inform some of your subsequent sessions. But just looking at some of the value differences, this is probably the longest section of this anyway, is that traditionals and boomers very much on experience is absolutely everything. What you're doing is more important than why you're doing it. Belief in the potential of youth. Risk is an absolute driver for the older generations. They understand politics as being a very crucial thing. In other words, who you know and the color of your skin, as Ian pointed out, these are all terribly important points for the older generation. And person to person, you know, sitting down over lunch and talking face to face or speaking on the phone at a push with somebody. As newer generations, far more into looking at competency rather than experience. How good are you rather than how long have you been doing it? So it's the meritocracy point there. Looking at facts and results rather than what somebody tells you from their experience. Younger generations tend to believe that they have got a higher hubris, that they are higher performers than they actually are. They tend to fancy risk far more than older generations. Very suspicious of politics, and quite rightly so. I don't think there are many people today who are not suspicious of politics, excepting those who are controlling it, and are probably used to being always on. In other words, a lot of decisions are made based on what your peers are telling you via social media, and I think that's something that older generations don't get as easily as Gen Y. When Gen Y make a decision, and whether this is purchasing something, I saw this via an agency model actually, before a purchase decision is made, you would generally see what your peers are saying before you would go into it, which leads us neatly into the idea of Glassdoor, which we'll look at in 1 second. So, the kinds of actions that you're looking for, and you might want to chat about this afternoon, are looking at creating a culture in the organization is where you promote flexibility at the workplace. You're looking at bringing in challenging work, openness, and an entrepreneurial environment. And that can be very difficult when you've got oldies running an organization to make those kinds of switches. I think you're lucky that you're in an innovative industry where some of those changes might come more easily. Certainly emphasize the why before you emphasize the what. People want to know why they have to do something rather than they have to do it. Frequent feedback. I don't know what the state of annual performance appraisals, are they big in the industry? Okay, so this idea of an annual appraisal that the baby boomers and Gen X, or baby boomers, Gen X wouldn't have had it because they prefer operating alone. But this idea of the annual performance appraisal absolutely on all fronts needs to go, where you're looking at constant, regular feedback, and not necessarily from your manager, but from your peers as well, is key. And the final point on Gen Y is this idea of recognition. Although technology and money are important, the idea of being recognized publicly via social media carries a lot more cachet. So there's something in the culture of the organization to have a look at. Now, in terms of employer brand, this to me is quite interesting. I picked this quote up this morning. I just did a quick browse because I wanted something fresh. This is about an agency, and I'm pretty sure the agency is in this room. So you can Google this later on if you want to. In fact, I know the agency is in this room. But this is just one thing, because I looked for a particular agency. This quote comes from Glassdoor.com. An employee, does anybody not know Glassdoor in this room? Perhaps I'm introducing. You don't know Glassdoor. Okay, it's like me. I'd never heard of Uber until the taxi drivers striked. It was the most fantastic advert thing. So Glassdoor is a website where employees can go and hear what other employees say about the organization to create a level of transparency. So you can see what your prospective employer is about. It's all about transparency. And in a sense, it's fighting the employer brand. So the employer might say, we're a wonderful employer, we offer this, da-da-da-da. If you want to know what really goes on in the organization, you go to Glassdoor. And Glassdoor is huge in the States. There is no question that it is coming to the UK as well. So you're going to have to start looking at alignment across employer brand and what social media allows you to do in terms of. So the comment here was, this obviously the agency was saying, you know, we're very good at developing people, et cetera, et cetera. Comment was, the advances made seem a bit superficial. They offered flex time, but it was always subject to approval. They assured reviews and raises, but these were tepid at best. Now, who knows if this is true? You know, is this another TripAdvisor scenario where people are just saying stuff? It doesn't matter, does it? It doesn't really matter, because the research is absolutely clear that decisions, once enough people start saying something, it's hard to believe that there isn't an element of truth in it. And I think that is the issue that you need to be looking at, is you have to adopt an employer brand with a degree of transparency that you would not have needed to do a couple of years ago because you could have blagged your way through it. So some of the interesting point on the issues of employer brand. The key message is that social media has made your brand absolutely transparent and will increasingly do so. So employee engagement excuse me, is the new employer brand. What that means is that employees and prospective employees are going to be talking to each other saying, what's it like to work in that organization? And if they're hearing that what the adverts say doesn't match up with the experience of the existing employees, you will simply not attract the nice, diverse, high potentials that you're looking for in your organization. So I'm quite safe, I think, in saying that engagement of your existing employees is going to be your new employer brand, is how happy you can make them. And that's a real challenge. So some stats to back that up. Recent Gallup poll, 13% of employees are engaged. I'm quite interested in the definition of engagement, by the way, whether you go for the discretionary, aligned with values, but that's another topic. And some other stats. 51% of employees experience buyer's remorse. 54% of employees would recommend their employers, so 46% would not. And 83% leave in the first year, which kind of fits in with the churn figures. So if you consider those statistics, and you consider the fact that engagement is the new employer brand, that would explain why it's getting harder and harder to attract good people, because people are talking about the organization. So in terms of employer brand, start looking after employee engagement, and the employer brand will start looking after itself. That's kind of the first point to come out of that. I've put up a table here of some interesting actions, and I'm just going to look at the broad headings of those. We've covered some of these already, so I can go through them quite quickly, but meaningful work is absolutely crucial. This idea of transactional work, give the transactional work to the robots, I think is the key message. Don't give it to people, because it won't engage. Management need to be more hands-on than ever before and not sitting in ivory towers. You need an incredible work environment, something that you've never, previous generations wouldn't have had, in terms of flexibility, constant reviews, constant development for employees, which we'll look at shortly. Growth opportunities we're going to talk about in a second, so that everybody has opportunities. And crucially, there needs to be trust in the leadership. We're seeing this in politics increasingly, that unless you trust the leadership of an organization, and of a country at least, it's really difficult to start bringing the populace behind you, and you start seeing all the kinds of splits that we're seeing in the so-called multicultural society that we're in, where there's a lot of work to be done, and a lot of that is because there's a lack of trust in leadership. So it is in your agencies, is that I think as the HR people in this room especially, you've got a good job in front of you convincing the leadership to be authentic and to be transparent in their actions in an age of transparency. So the next point is this thing about developing skills and career paths, which we heard a little bit about earlier. In terms of developing skills and career paths, there is no question that newer generations, because they've had an education which hasn't been available to previous generations, offering technical skills is not enough. People are looking for career paths. So one of the things you'll need to put into your employer brand is the fact that you are offering a career, and that needs to be a basic part of your marketing and of your employer brand. That we offer careers to people. We don't just offer technical training and ensure that you're the best at what you do. New organizational structures make it very attractive for people to go solo. Tons of my work is done, you know, I can do a lot of what I do from a beach a lot of the time when I'm not in meetings and not at conferences. I do a lot of analysis, I do a lot of technical work. I'm disappearing off to South Africa in November for the worst 3 months of winter. I'm probably not even going to be missed. I'm probably not missed even when I am here, actually. But the point is that if you want to attract people to working to your organization, you're going to have to create an attractive enough package so that people would want to do that rather than contracting, rather than consulting, rather than working at home. And that is a challenge that you're looking for in terms of creating a diverse market. So in effect, it's career paths for everyone. Just to highlight where that story came most true to me, when I joined Accenture, there were two types of people, and I believe this is true of your industry. I did check this out. At Accenture, there were techies who came into the organization who were expected to do programming and all of the technology stuff. And then there were the golden people who were going to be the future rainmakers, the partners of the organization, people who would be earning their $2 million a year. As a techie, you knew that all you were doing was coming into the organization to get a great training, and you had every intention of leaving because you knew you were never going to be a golden, smiley, leading rainmaker. You were never going to be a leader of people in the organization. Accenture never ever addressed that. There was never a career path for somebody that wasn't a glorious rainmaker. And I think that that is something, when they changed that, the hemorrhaging was much higher than your 30%. So you had a kind of a 50, 60, you were pretty much guaranteed that anybody who wasn't going to be a partner was virtually asked to leave the firm, actually. So if they didn't think that you were partner material, you were asked to leave. Of course, the cost of retraining and recruiting everybody was enormous. And so it wasn't until somebody had the brilliant idea of saying, you know, we actually need to create a separate career path, in a sense, for technical people, that the organization managed to reduce that cost and actually started developing its technical assets, its technical value, by retaining it in the firm. So those are the kind of key points I'd like to do. I hope that there's a way of getting this through before this afternoon, if there's a way of emailing it or printing it out so that you can get some of the points. But I'd like to say thank you very much, and I think we'll take questions later.
Max, thank you. We will.
Thank you.
Can I just, while you're there, can I just ask one question? You haven't mentioned money. How does that fit into all of this?
Yes. So money as a motivator, I presume you're talking about. Money is an interesting one. Most people overestimate the impact of compensation on performance. There are two things that are misunderstood. One is, what is the impact of compensation on employee performance, and what is the impact of engagement on employee performance? So in terms of money, in the first instance, money motivates up to a point. It's a hygiene factor, to use HR terminology. Hygiene factor means it's a basic factor that you need to have just to be there to play the game, in a sense. Increasing money by 30% gives you a disproportionate increase in employee performance. So you start finding that 30% will give you 10%, 15%. And when you start getting to doubling salary, you certainly are nowhere near doubling the performance that you get out of employees. So money is, in a sense, one of the most overused levers to do that. If you say, well, what are the right levers for employing performance? It's pretty much what we've spoken about. It's about creating a meaningful work environment is absolutely crucial. Technology is probably a bigger driver for Gen Y than money is. So providing the very latest cool technology is probably more than that. The other issue, just to come back onto that, is this relationship, which I think will again be of interest to both the business and the HR audiences, is this idea of engagement, employee engagement. We are in an age where you can't pick up a piece of business literature without talking about this idea of engaged employees or high-performing employees. The latest research, and I'm talking about 6 months old, and you'll start seeing more of it now, is that it's probably the other way around, is that performance causes engagement. What does that mean? It means that employees who perform well are more likely to be engaged than employees that don't perform well. So your low performers don't get engaged, and so if you're going to spend money, rather spend it on performance programs to increase engagement. Don't spend money on engagement to increase performance.